The sun was dipping low over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of molten orange and bruised purple. Waves licked the soft sand with a gentle, unyielding rhythm, the kind that whispered peace to anyone who cared to listen. But for Karen, peace was a concept as foreign as humility. She stood on the balcony of her beige beachside home, arms crossed, eyes scanning the row of homes that lined the shore like obedient soldiers. To her, they were more than neighbors. They were subjects, and she was the ruler they hadn't yet realized they didn't need. She had invented the Sunset Shores Homeowners Association a few months ago, a self-appointed title that carried no legitimacy except in her own mind. But that hadn't stopped her. Notices were plastered on doors like badges of fear, warnings about lawn chairs too close to the sand, complaints about umbrellas that weren't color-coordinated, even threats about using beach towels that she deemed offensive to the community aesthetic. Every morning, she walked the boardwalk, clipboard in hand, inspecting, judging, micromanaging lives that weren't hers to manage. Some neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, laughing nervously at the absurdity of her authority. Others, more timid, obeyed out of exhaustion. Karen had perfected the art of intimidation, the voice that dripped saccharine sweetness while wielding the threat of fines, the phone calls at odd hours that left residents wondering if she had spies in every household. And yet, she thrived on the chaos she created, the little tremors of panic that ran through the neighborhood like electricity. That evening, as she sipped a chilled glass of white wine, Karen's gaze landed on the newest addition to the block, a tall, composed man unloading boxes from a sleek black SUV. He moved with a quiet precision, each box placed gently on the porch as though it contained fragile dreams, not just belongings. He was black, the kind of presence Karen instinctively mistrusted, though she would never admit it aloud. Karen's lips curled into a smirk. Another opportunity. Another conquest. She introduced herself the very next day, breezing into the driveway with that self-satisfied smile, the one she believed could bend the world to her will. "I'm Karen," she said, voice syrupy, "president of our HOA. Welcome to Sunset Shores." The man's eyes lifted slowly from the box he was unpacking. His stare was calm, unwavering, and unassuming, but it carried the weight of someone who had endured and survived storms far fiercer than hers. "Marcus," he replied simply, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Karen's hand met his briefly, but she felt an itch in her chest she hadn't anticipated, one that she quickly ignored. "If you have any questions about our community rules," she said, tilting her head in that performative way she had perfected, "I'd be more than happy to guide you." Marcus nodded politely, a thin smile playing on his lips, and went about his work, ignoring the underlying threat in her tone. Karen, however, didn't ignore it. She watched him the entire day, cataloging his movements, noting the precise way he arranged his garden, the time he spent inspecting the ocean from his porch, and the subtle way his presence seemed to unsettle her own sense of dominion.
Days passed, and Karen escalated her campaign. She left violation notices on his porch, a towel left too close to the sand, a chair slightly askew. She called imaginary HOA board meetings and invited him to attend, only to berate him for trivialities when he showed up. Marcus's neighbors whispered that she was overstepping, that this was harassment. But Karen smiled politely whenever confronted, spinning tales of community upkeep and safety. Marcus, meanwhile, did not retaliate immediately. He had seen this before, not in beach communities, but in the corridors of law firms, in boardrooms where men like Karen thrived on fear. He documented everything silently and meticulously, taking photographs, saving emails, recording conversations with precision. He knew the real power wasn't in confrontation, it was in preparation. One morning, Karen's confidence cracked for the first time. She had stormed over to his home after a complaint about a fire pit he had set up on the sand near his property line. "Marcus," she barked, pointing her finger like a sword, "you're in direct violation of HOA Code 14, subsection 7. Remove it immediately or face consequences." Marcus looked up from the legal book he was studying, one eyebrow arched. "Karen," he said, voice calm, measured, "I reviewed that code. There is no subsection 7, no such regulation, and no HOA officially recognized by the county." The air between them shifted. Karen blinked, momentarily disarmed. That doesn't matter. I enforce order here." Marcus's smile was polite but unyielding. "Order?" he asked. "Or fear?" She froze. She had expected defiance, perhaps some panic, maybe even compliance after enough intimidation. But she hadn't expected truth, not spoken so gently, so unassailable. The fire pit incident became a turning point. Karen doubled down, sending letters to other neighbors, exaggerating Marcus's violations, trying to rally support. But whispers had begun. Residents started speaking out quietly about her antics, questioning the legitimacy of her authority. Each complaint she issued, each thinly veiled threat, was met with polite resistance or silent recording devices catching every word. Marcus's approach was surgical. He invited her to a community discussion about regulations, a meeting she imagined would be her stage. She strutted into the backyard, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture and intimidate. But Marcus had prepared witnesses, neighbors who recounted stories of her harassment, emails and photos of arbitrary fines she had issued, records of board meetings she had held without anyone's consent. Karen faltered under the weight of undeniable evidence. Her voice, once commanding, now quavered. She tried to interrupt, to redirect, to use charm and anger in a frantic cocktail, but Marcus remained steady, professional, and unflinching. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, struck at her carefully constructed image. That night, Karen sat alone in her house, the ocean whispering outside, thinking she had conquered fear itself. And yet for the first time, fear crept into her chest, not for her neighbors, but for herself. Marcus's calm had begun to unravel the empire she had built on lies, intimidation, and self-aggrandizement.
Weeks turned into months. Karen's tactics grew more desperate. She called the police on Marcus for fabricated incidents, tried to install surveillance cameras to monitor violations, and sent intimidating letters that were eventually returned unopened. Each action only strengthened his case, each act of malice meticulously documented and preserved. Marcus, in the meantime, remained composed. He had begun working with a local attorney to prepare for the inevitable showdown, gathering affidavits from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's fake HOA regime. The legal web was growing, and every thread pointed to the same conclusion. Karen's downfall was no longer a question of if, but when. Then came the fateful day when Karen attempted her boldest maneuver yet. She organized a board meeting on the beach itself, announcing that all homeowners must attend or face fines. She envisioned a gathering of fearful, obedient neighbors ready to watch her assert dominance over Marcus. But Marcus arrived prepared. He had set up his own presentation, legal documents in hand, evidence displayed clearly, and a small group of neighbors who had agreed to testify about the harassment and illegal fines. Karen's voice rang out over the crashing waves, commanding attention. "This is your community, and I am your authority. Anyone who disobeys me will face consequences." A hush fell, but not of fear, of anticipation. Marcus stepped forward calmly. "Karen," he said, holding up a binder thick with documentation, "this is not your community to rule. You have been issuing fines without authorization, harassing neighbors, and creating a false HOA.
All of this is illegal." Gasps ran through the crowd. Karen's smirk faltered. She lunged to snatch the binder, but Marcus moved just enough to prevent it. Neighbors began speaking out one by one, recounting experiences of arbitrary fines, threats, and intimidation. The tide had turned. Karen's voice rose, shrill and frantic, but it was drowned out by the collective truth of the community she had sought to dominate. By the end of that day, Karen retreated to her home, her empire of sand slipping through her fingers like grains between unwilling hands. She realized bitterly that power built on fear was fragile, that control over others without legitimacy was nothing but a house of cards. Marcus had not just resisted her, he had dismantled the foundation of her self-imposed reign. And yet the story was far from over. Karen, wounded in pride and ego, began plotting. Revenge simmered in her mind like a storm gathering on the horizon. Marcus had taught her the first lesson. She was not invincible, but she was not yet finished. And so the stage was set for the next act, where cunning and justice would collide in ways no one on Sunset's shores could yet imagine. The waves continued to lap the shore, indifferent to the battles of humans. But under the fading sun, Karen and Marcus had both realized one truth. The beach belonged to no one, yet everyone had a stake in claiming it, not through power, but through principle. And in the quiet, Marcus smiled to himself, knowing that the real test had only just begun.
Karen sat in her sunlit living room, the blinds drawn tight, staring at the piles of papers and empty wine glasses that had accumulated over the past week. Her normally pristine home looked like a battlefield of her own making, each stack of evidence a reminder of her failures. She had always believed that control was hers by virtue of fear and self-assumed authority, yet here she was, exposed, humiliated, and powerless. She slammed a fist on the coffee table, scattering receipts and letters, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. He can't just take everything from me," she muttered to herself, pacing back and forth. The truth gnawed at her. Marcus had turned the tables effortlessly, and the neighbors, once cowed, were beginning to see her as what she really was, a bully hiding behind a false title. Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill chirp of her phone. It was another email from the county office confirming that there was no official HOA registered under her name. Karen swore, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "If I can't beat him legally, then I'll beat him in every other way." The next morning, she returned to the beach with renewed determination. Her plan was subtle at first: intimidation, sly comments, veiled threats. She began showing up at Marcus's property unannounced, claiming to inspect the landscape, the sand, even the position of his garden chairs. Marcus, calm and collected as always, treated her presence like a minor inconvenience, acknowledging her perfunctorily, but never giving her the reaction she craved. That evening, Karen escalated. She sent messages to every neighbor, painting Marcus as disruptive and dangerous, claiming he had threatened her and other residents. She fabricated stories about his supposed violations, attempting to turn the community against him. But her lies found no purchase. Marcus had already shared evidence of her harassment, her phony fines, and her aggressive behaviors. Neighbors who once hesitated began standing up for him quietly but firmly, refusing to engage in Karen's escalating drama. One morning, Karen decided to go even further. She hired a small team of private investigators to document Marcus's activities, hoping to uncover some fault or misstep. The investigators followed him discreetly, reporting back that he attended local events, visited friends and family, and conducted himself with impeccable civility. Each report, rather than helping her, reinforced the truth that Marcus was beyond reproach.
Frustration boiled in Karen, turning her meticulous control into reckless desperation. One afternoon, she confronted Marcus directly, stepping onto his property without permission, voice sharp and accusing. "Marcus, you think you're untouchable. You're disrupting the community. You're disrespecting everyone here." Marcus looked up from trimming a small hedge, expression serene, as though speaking to a child. "Karen, the community respects the law, not threats. You've repeatedly tried to manipulate and intimidate everyone, and it's time to stop." Her hands trembled as she pointed at him. "I built this community. I protect it. You have no right." Marcus set down the clippers, stepping forward, calm and deliberate. "Protection isn't control, Karen. Authority isn't self-appointed. You confuse fear with respect, and that's why this will all end badly for you." Her face reddened with anger. "You'll regret this," she spat, storming back toward her home. But the seeds of doubt had already begun to sprout. For the first time, Karen realized that Marcus's strategy wasn't just defensive, it was offensive, meticulous, and impossible to anticipate without experience. Over the following weeks, Marcus moved decisively. He contacted legal authorities, presenting evidence of Karen's fabricated fines, intimidation, and harassment. County officials confirmed her lack of authority, and letters went out declaring her Sunset Shores HOA void and unenforceable. Karen's emails to neighbors warning of fines now had no effect. She was powerless to compel anyone to obey her. The tension reached its peak during a local community gathering. Karen had prepared a speech, imagining herself as the wronged authority, the misunderstood guardian of the Beachside neighborhood. But when she began, the room was filled with murmurs and skeptical glances. Marcus had arranged for a presentation complete with visual evidence of her harassment, audio recordings of her threats, and a timeline of fines she had illegally imposed.
Karen's voice faltered as each piece of evidence was displayed on a large screen. The neighbors began recounting their own experiences, stories of small humiliations, fines that were never valid, and manipulations that had left them anxious for months. Karen tried to interrupt, to charm and cajole, to plead, but the room had shifted irrevocably. The audience no longer saw a figure of authority, they saw a bully exposed. Marcus stepped forward calmly, his presence commanding, without intimidation. "This is not about personal vendetta," he said. "This is about accountability. Karen has repeatedly abused the trust of her neighbors, claiming authority she does not possess. She has manipulated and harassed, all under the guise of protecting our community. Today, that ends." Karen's hands shook, her carefully constructed persona crumbling in real time. She attempted one final bluff, claiming she had legal documents to assert her authority, but Marcus had anticipated her every move. The documents were forged, easily disproven by county records and testimony. Each attempt she made to regain control only dug her deeper into disrepute. The community meeting ended with a unanimous declaration Karen had no authority, no legitimacy, and no claim to enforce any rules she had invented. The neighbors cheered, a mixture of relief and vindication, washing over them like the tide outside. Karen fled, humiliated, and retreated into her home, slamming the door on the world she had tried so hard to dominate. But Marcus was not done. The evidence he had collected was more than enough to ensure Karen faced legal consequences if she continued her harassment. Notices were sent, confirming that any further attempts at intimidation or enforcement would result in fines, lawsuits, and possible criminal charges. For Karen, the walls were closing in. She tried to fight back through gossip and manipulation, attempting to turn the remaining compliant neighbors against Marcus. But the truth was on his side now. Each attempt she made was recorded, documented, and added to the growing file that chronicled her descent into obsession and abuse of power. Karen's frustration turned to paranoia.
She began suspecting every neighbor, every friendly gesture, every casual glance as a conspiracy against her. Sleep eluded her, replaced by anxiety and resentment. Her empire, once imagined as unshakable, had collapsed under the weight of preparation, documentation, and quiet resilience. Marcus, in contrast, remained serene. He did not gloat, he did not flaunt his success. His actions were methodical, precise, and fair. He had not sought revenge out of malice, he had sought justice, and the outcome was inevitable, given Karen's hubris and misconduct. One evening, Karen confronted him one last time, standing at the edge of the beach as the sun bled into the horizon. "Marcus," she hissed, "this isn't over. You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me." Marcus regarded her quietly, the ocean wind tousling his hair. "Karen, the law and the community have spoken. Your reign of fear is over. You cannot bully people into obedience. You cannot fabricate authority and expect respect. This ends." Karen turned away, fury mingling with despair. For the first time, she realized that Marcus's calm, relentless approach had done what intimidation never could. It had dismantled her power, exposed her lies, and given the community back its freedom. The tide rose and fell, washing away footprints in the sand, as if nature itself had taken note of the balance restored. Karen walked back toward her home, defeated, while Marcus stood on the beach, a quiet sentinel of justice, knowing that the community he had protected was safe for now. But Karen's story did not end in mere humiliation. Her obsession with control, her desire for revenge, would linger, smoldering beneath the surface. And Marcus, aware of this, prepared silently. Evidence was documented, legal strategies were reviewed, and the next phase of accountability was ready to unfold. By the time the sun had disappeared entirely behind the horizon, the beach was calm, the waves whispering secrets to the sand. Marcus knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew that Karen's power had been permanently undermined. The first part of the reckoning was complete. The next would be even more decisive.
The dawn broke with an almost eerie stillness, the kind of morning that feels suspended in time. Karen sat in her living room, staring at the pale light filtering through the blinds, her hands trembling. The past weeks had been a relentless storm, each wave of exposure and humiliation crashing harder than the last. Yet she refused to surrender fully. In her mind, control was everything, and if she could not command the beachside neighborhood through authority, then she would reclaim it through cunning, manipulation, and relentless obsession. Marcus, meanwhile, began the day with quiet precision. He reviewed the files he had compiled over months, photographs of Karen's arbitrary fines, audio recordings of her threats, emails she had sent to neighbors containing false allegations. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced, logged, and ready for the final phase. He knew Karen's desperation would lead her to make mistakes, and he intended to capitalize on every one. Karen's first move came in the form of legal harassment. She filed a flurry of false claims, hoping to tie Marcus up in court, drain his resources, and intimidate him into submission. But Marcus anticipated this. Each claim was preemptively countered, and the courts, already aware of Karen's past misconduct, quickly dismissed her filings. The frustration that had fueled Karen's aggression now began to twist into panic. Her emails to neighbors attempting to paint Marcus as disruptive or dangerous were returned unread, or answered with polite but firm warnings about harassment. In her fury, Karen decided to confront Marcus directly. She appeared at his doorstep early one morning, the ocean wind whipping strands of hair into her face, voice sharp and demanding. "Marcus, you think you can humiliate me and get away with it? You're going to pay for this." Marcus opened the door calmly, as he always did, his expression unreadable but resolute. "Karen," he said, voice steady, "all I've done is ensure that the community is protected and that the law is followed.
Your actions have consequences, and they're unavoidable now." Karen's hands shook as she brandished the folder, a desperate bluff. "These are official notices. You have no right to—" Marcus gently took the folder from her hands and flipped through it. Each document was either fabricated or improperly executed, easily disproven by county records. "Karen, these hold no weight. You've crossed the line from intimidation into illegal harassment. I suggest you reconsider your actions before things escalate further, for both our sakes." Humiliated yet defiant, Karen retreated, plotting her next move. She began to stir unrest among the remaining compliant neighbors, spreading rumors, whispering doubts, and attempting to create divisions. But Marcus had prepared for this. He had already secured statements from every family who had been affected by Karen's schemes. When the whispers reached the point of confrontation, Marcus was ready with the truth: documents, photographs, and recordings that left no room for doubt. The next escalation came when Karen attempted to seize control of community spaces, claiming ownership over the sand near her property. She called in security personnel, attempting to forcibly remove Marcus and his friends from public areas. But Marcus, calm and prepared, had informed the authorities in advance, providing evidence of her harassment and false claims. The security personnel, upon reviewing the records, refused to act on her instructions, leaving Karen fuming on the beach alone. Neighbors began to take notice of Karen's unraveling composure. Wherever once they had feared her, now they observed her desperation. Small acts of defiance, children playing freely, families enjoying the sand without her interference, became quiet rebellions against her tyranny. Karen's authority crumbled with each passing day, her self-imposed power dissolving like salt in the tide.
Karen's final act of desperation came one evening, when she attempted to disrupt a community gathering, hoping to humiliate Marcus publicly. She stormed into the event, voice shrill, demanding attention. But the community, now united and informed, stood firmly behind Marcus. Every accusation she made was met with calm correction, every threat countered with evidence, every attempt at control blocked by collective vigilance. Marcus finally addressed the crowd, his presence commanding yet composed. "This is not personal. It is about accountability and justice. Karen has repeatedly abused her neighbor's trust, claiming authority she did not possess. Today, we reaffirm that control over others through fear is unacceptable. This ends now." Karen's hands shook, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She tried to argue, to challenge, to regain some fragment of the authority she had imagined, but it was futile. The tide of evidence, truth, and community resolve was overwhelming. She stumbled back, retreating from the gathering, her empire of fear reduced to ruins. The weeks that followed saw Karen's isolation deepen. She attempted small acts of retaliation, but each was met with swift legal or communal correction. Her reputation, once carefully curated, was irreparably damaged. The neighbors who had once feared her now avoided her, speaking openly about her actions, their stories corroborated by Marcus's meticulous records. Marcus, ever calm, did not gloat. He understood the difference between victory and vindication. His goal had been justice, not revenge, but the consequences of Karen's hubris were clear. She had learned through exposure and defeat that power built on intimidation was fragile, and that integrity, patience, and preparation could overcome even the most tyrannical individuals. Months later, the beachside community had transformed. Children played freely along the shore, neighbors organized communal events, and the atmosphere, once tense under Karen's shadow, was filled with laughter and life. Marcus, respected and admired, remained a quiet guardian, ensuring that fairness and accountability were upheld without arrogance or malice.
Karen, now a shadow of her former self, lived in her house, the wind and waves her only companions. She would occasionally peer through the blinds, watching the community thrive, but she never interfered. Her lessons had been harsh, and the consequences permanent. She had underestimated the strength of truth, the power of documentation, and the resilience of a community united against tyranny. The ocean continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to human struggles, yet perfectly reflective of the balance restored on the shore. Marcus walked along the sand one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He knew the battle had been won, not through aggression or intimidation, but through steadfast preparation, calm judgment, and unwavering commitment to justice. And in that quiet moment, the waves whispered a subtle acknowledgment of the victory, not just for Marcus, but for the community he had protected. Karen's reign of fear was over. Justice, patience, and truth had prevailed, leaving behind a neighborhood that could finally call the Beachside their own. No further threats, no false authorities, no arbitrary fines, just the sand, the waves, and a community free at last from the shadow of Karen's tyranny. And Marcus, ever vigilant, knew that while people like Karen might rise elsewhere, here, justice had won. The sun disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving a sky streaked with crimson and gold. The beachside homes glowed softly in the fading light, the sound of waves mingling with laughter and conversation. For the first time in months, the shore was at peace. Karen, defeated and silent, watched from her balcony as Marcus and the neighbors celebrated their reclaimed freedom. The lessons of power, fear, and accountability were etched into her mind, indelible and unrelenting. She had tried to bend a community to her will and failed spectacularly. Marcus, standing at the edge of the water, looked out across the ocean and smiled faintly. The battle had been won, not through aggression or intimidation, but through steadfast preparation, calm judgment, and unwavering commitment to justice. The waves lapped gently at the shore, as if whispering a promise. No matter how strong the storm, the tide of justice would always return, relentless, patient, and true.